Well, in a sense, we were fleeing an eastern city which had become somewhat violent in our lives, and we ended up going to Indonesia as school teachers. We each had a suitcase, and we planned to be there a year.
And 9 years later, came back with 500 textiles and 2 children.
And a container full of stuff.
Well, we started in Jakarta, and we would sometimes we were teaching school, and we'd sometimes come home from school, and there'd be a little line of tukangs, textile peddlers with their bags, and they'd come into our living room and spread things out, and we'd have conversations, and we'd have tea, and so we started in our home in Jakarta. But then as we traveled, we would always go to markets. As soon as people understood that we knew about textiles and we were genuinely interested, they'd invite us to their home, they'd invite us to look at their heirloom pieces. Textiles became a lens for us to understand the different cultures, and also an entree to talk to people and get to know people. And it was just a wonderful way for us to experience Indonesia. We agreed with each other that we would start collecting textiles from every place that does weaving, not understanding that Indonesia is an archipelago of 18,000 islands that covers an area that is greater than from San Francisco to New York, and there are 350 or more distinct cultures with their own language, not dialects, but separate languages. It's an incredibly complex and fascinating country.
Perhaps the most common way these textiles would be used would be as clothing, everyday clothing and ceremonial clothing. One of the other very common usages would be what you might call culturally prescribed gift giving in many, many different kinds of ceremonies, from marriage ceremonies, birth ceremonies, ceremonies surrounding death, and also in healing. There are actually certain textiles in Indonesia where a shaman would take a pinch out of a textile. So you would see a textile that had a lot of little holes in it, and that little pinch would be used to help someone get better.
This particular piece is a good example of multi-use. It's from southern Sumatra, sometimes referred to as a ship's cloth. And you can see there is a ship here and people on the ship. And these cloths were used in rituals that having to do with life transitions. But the most important, and I think a really fascinating use of this kind of cloth, is to communicate with ancestors, to ask ancestors for protection. In Indonesia, in many of the cultures, the ancestors are very close to us now. They're just a thin veil between us and our ancestors. And these pieces have ancestors on them. You can see the ancestors on the ship. And the people in this area of southern Sumatra believe that during life transitions, a person is very vulnerable, which I think is psychologically true. There's no question that's true. And so they're asking for ancestors for protection as you move from one life phase to another. And these have not been made since the early 20th century. For many years, experts in Indonesian textiles thought there was no textiles that went back beyond about 1850. Not too long ago, like within the last decade, some pieces were carbon dated to go back as far as the 1500s.
Or even perhaps older than that. We have pieces that we've never carbon dated, but people who know a lot more than we do estimate that they could be maybe back to the 1700s.
This is a speckled ikat. So this is ikat. Then it has this supplementary weave, and it has twining here to finish it at the end. So 3 techniques on this one cloth that looks fairly simple.
This piece could well have taken 10 years to make. And it's, you know, it's not that it's that complicated, but the color saturation required, you know, dyeing many times. And it could well have taken 10 years to make. This piece would have been presented this way to a pregnant woman because the circularity, the continuous warp, it's like on one side is the mother, which is passing life through these threads to the child.
This piece is a small sarong. It's a tube, and it's very unusual because it's cross stitch. It's little tiny cross stitches. And we've only seen 2 cross-stitch pieces in all of the Indonesian textiles we've looked at. So one of the things that's so fascinating about Indonesian textiles is when you look at a piece, if you know what you're looking at, you know where it came from. You know what island. Sometimes with certain places, you look at a textile, you not only know what island it came from, you know what village, you can even know what family.
And with batik, batik is done, you have the whole cloth, in this case a piece of cotton, and then you apply wax, and it must be applied to both sides of the piece, and very carefully, obviously, because you want to apply it exactly on the same place on both sides. And then it's dyed. Then they have to take that wax off and reapply wax for different colors and different parts of the design. And so it's a tremendously complicated process.
Clarity is very difficult with ikat. You can imagine. You're weaving a design that's already been dyed, and so it's difficult to get this kind of clarity. And you can see anything that's white here was tied off the entire dye throughout the entire dyeing process. We are so excited about doing this show in San Francisco because the textiles reflect a very important and exciting time in our lives.
We're having a gamelan orchestra. We're having the weaver, the batik artist. We're having 2 people come from the Jakarta Textile Museum with very rare and important pieces of theirs to exhibit. And so it's going to really be something that fills the whole tribal and textile art show with this Indonesian theme.
And this is an opportunity for us to share our love of the textiles, our love of Indonesia, to share what we love, to share what we've collected, and to share that time in Indonesia, which was a very special time for us.